Hello and welcome back, and thank you for joining me for this, our next lesson through the major arcana of the tarot. We're going to be dealing with cards 18 and 19 throughout this lesson. Card 18, the moon, and card 19, the sun. So let's start with the moon. Rather than starting with the Rider-Waite, I'm going to go right back to the beginning, and we're going to take a look at one of our earliest representations of this card from the 15th century Visconti Sforza. So here it is. You can see a woman dressed in red and blue, and she is holding a crescent moon in her raised hand. Now in this card it's a simple depiction. This is the goddess Diana, the goddess of the moon. So all of the qualities that you can attribute to Diana are actually attributed to this card. So, when we look at some of the other images from a little bit later, the imagery starts to get a lot more complex. Let's take a look at these first. These are modern cards. This is from a majors only deck called Fortuna's Wheel Tarot by the incredible tarot artist Nigel Jackson. These are modern, but they were based on the symbolism of the early French Jacques Vivey deck, which actually predates a lot of the Marseille decks. So, what have we got here? There's another female figure on this card, but this is a different deity or figure from mythology. What we have here is one of the three Moirae of Greek mythology, or the three fates. Now you can see with this one, she has a spinning pole, and she's spinning a thread from the top of that pole. So this identifies her as the Moirae with the name Clothai. So she is the spinner of fate, and the thread represents human life. She spun out the thread to determine the length of each human life. So what does that tell us about the moon card? This also speaks about the moon denoting a measurement of time. Clothai measures the length of human life. The moon is one of our earliest indicators of time. The moon indicates our measurement of months comes from the phases of the moon. So, like the sun card, which we'll look at later, both of these cards denote the passing of time. Okay? So that's one depiction, but there's so much more to the moon card than just the passing of the time. Let's have a look at the Marseille, because this is where the imagery starts to get really complex, but this is also very close. This kind of set the pattern for much of what we see today on so many modern decks. We can see a pool at the base of the card, and actually rising from the pool is what looks like a crayfish or a crab, probably a crayfish. On either side of the pool you can see what look like dogs. This could possibly be a dog and a wolf because they are different colours. And then behind those you see two towers, and above the towers the moon. Now let's just look at one tiny detail that corresponds with this previous card that we've looked at. You can see here on both cards drops of dew emerging from the moon. So there's a myth behind this. It's said that the moon, or Diana, as she rose, gathered all of the lost and forgotten memories of men and collected them in her silver cup, at which stage, towards the end of the night as she was setting, she poured those memories out on the earth in the form of dew. So, if those dewdrops represent memories, they represent dreams. They can also represent the unconscious. But we have other symbols of the unconscious here. The pool, water with the crayfish rising, We could say this is the pool of the unconscious. Let's look at the dog and the wolf baying at the moon. We know that a lot of animals react to the influence of the moon, as do we of human beings. That's most clearly shown in the menstrual cycle of women. The length of that cycle is obviously denoted by the phases of the moon. That's why cycles are monthly. And we also have that term lunacy to represent madness, but it literally goes back to the Latin word luna, the influence of the moon. The sort of well-known thing of dogs, wolves howling at the full moon. So what do those dogs represent? The dogs howling at the moon, or the dog and the wolf howling at the moon, very much represent our fears. If you think of the crayfish being drawn up out of the pool of the unconscious by the influence of the moon, the dogs baying and howling at the moon, all three of these things represent our fears in different ways and on different levels, as we'll see as we look at some of these other depictions. But what about the towers? There are two towers, one either side of the card. There's a passageway between those two towers, so it suggests that actually as the crayfish rises from the pool, it's being drawn up towards the moon. But to actually reach the moon, he must actually pass a very specific path. So that's the Marseille image. This has very much set the pattern for most of what comes later. Let's just have a look at one very strange and interesting variant. One of my favourite antique decks, the Swiss 1JJ. This shows quite a sort of garbled variation of the Marseille. There is just one dog in this image, and he's sat peacefully next to a minstrel who appears to be serenading a woman who's standing on a balcony on the other side of the card. So that seems quite a sort of idyllic, romantic, moonlit scene. But just look below. The actual perspective of the image seems to be taken from the veranda or terrace of another building. And in quite a sinister way, crawling up that sort of wall or fencing of the veranda, you can see the crayfish along with its two offspring. So although this seems to be idyllic, romantic and inspirational, the fears are still lurking below the surface. It's a beautiful image and very clever. So, moving on to the modern depictions from the 20th century. Let's have a look at our Golden Dawn deck. Remember, this is a modern reworking of the Golden Dawn Tarot. So there are a few little modern additions in here, nothing that need concern us, and certainly not for while we're explaining the symbolism of the card anyway. It's very similar to the Marseille, but just one little interesting thing. If you look closely at these dewdrops, they're a different shape from the dewdrops on the earlier cards. They're actually shaped like the Hebrew letter, which is the first letter of the name of God. These are yods. So there's a subtle shift in emphasis here. There is the nourishing dew of the moon, but all of a sudden, by actually tying that dew to the name of God, what you actually see is divine inspiration. Okay? So otherwise the image is very similar. You can see the crayfish crawling out of the pool. We now have a very distinct path running between the two towers. If you think of the towers as the marker of that path, the path is now shown there. But there's something else very interesting on this card. We have our dogs and our wolves, but also against the towers we can see Egyptian divinities. Now these are modelled after the god Anubis, the god of the afterlife. So what does that say about this path? If Anubis is the gatekeeper to this path, that shows that the path towards the moon is a transformative path and a way towards new life. Okay? So what about the Rider card? We've got all those key, I think this gives us the key. This really does actually give us the key to the meaning of this card very much, more than any of the others for me. So we've got the crayfish coming out of the pool. We have the path. We have the dog and the wolf baying. We have the moon. We have the dew coming from the moon. The dew again are yod-shaped, the dewdrops. So the calm, the sort of uneasy calmness of the moon shedding nourishing dew on the landscape below. The pool of the unconscious. The dog and the wolf baying. So if the dog, the wolf and the crayfish are fears, I mentioned before that they are perhaps different levels of fear. Now I want to use Waite's own words here because I think they sum it up beautifully. This is the pictorial key to the tarot. This was Arthur Edward Waite's commentary to the Rider-Waite deck. It's a fascinating book. It's a little bit crusty and archaic, and sometimes you feel that he trips himself up in what he's saying. Sometimes you wonder whether he's actually talked with Pamela Coleman Smith about what many of the minor arcana cards meant and what she was depicting. But nevertheless, it's a really valuable text, and with the major arcana in particular. Now listen to this, where he's talking about the dogs, the dog, the wolf and the crayfish. The dog and wolf are the fears of the natural mind in the presence of that place of exit, where there is only reflected light to guide it. So, the dog and the wolf, fears of the natural mind in the presence of that place of exit. Now, the place of exit is the pool. So, the dog and the wolf are actually aware of what's coming about at the pool, and they're frightened of it. Now, let's have a look at the crayfish itself. The moon illuminating our animal nature, types of which are represented below, the dog and the wolf, and that which comes up out of the deeps, the nameless and hideous tendency which is lower than the savage beast. It strives to attain manifestation, symbolised by the crawling from the abyss of water to the land. But as a rule, it sinks back where it came. So what do we make of that? If the dog and the wolf are our conscious fears, this is the deepest fears lodged in our unconscious. The things that come up in dreams. Now, we've already talked about dreams and inspiration in these earlier cards. Those dark aspects of our dreams that very rarely surface fully enough for us to understand, but they are our deepest instincts and our most primal fears. But that's the influence of the moon. So what are we to make of this? In effect, this is the card of the unconscious. This is the card of our primal instincts, our conscious instincts, but also our the most deeply buried instincts, the ones that we don't understand, but the ones that very often shape who we are and guide us unconsciously. So the moon rises, it draws these fears up, it stirs them up, vigorously. When this card appears, we can't ignore our fears. We can't ignore our insecurities. We can't ignore the power of our subconscious. So if this is pointing to the power of the subconscious, it's also pointing to the power of the intuitive and the psychic. All of those unexplained things about the human, about human beings. the things that science can't explain away, the things that science still maybe doesn't yet understand, that's all here in this moon card. So there's one more version that we need to look at before we look at the sort of darker aspects of this and the reversals. Let's look at the Thoth, the Crowley-Thoth version. This is very similar to what we've seen of in the New Golden Dawn, but there's a couple of interesting and very important variations here. What you see crawling up out of the waters is not a crayfish, but an Egyptian scarab beetle. But actually, it's debatable whether this beetle is crawling up or whether it's actually sinking back down. If you look what it's got within its claws, it's actually holding the sun. So actually what you see here is the sun sinking down into the underworld, or the sun seeking to rise again, but being dragged back down or obstructed by the scarab. So this is a battle between light and dark. Again, you see Anubis on either side of the towers. This battle between light and dark, actually, if it's won or lost, depends on whether we reach that place of understanding or enlightenment, the path towards the moon. What else have we got here? Again, you can see the yods dripping from the moon in the form of dew. So very much the moon shedding divine inspiration, divine enlightenment. But yeah, it's the duality between the sun and the moon is actually shown very powerfully here. That battle between conscious and unconscious, that constant tension, cycles. The moon sets, the sun rises, the sun sets, the moon rises. Back to the concept of time and the measurement of time, the passing of time. And with the passing of time, we come back to the figure of Clothai, which reminds us of the finite length of our life. So much in this card. It's one of my favourites. It's one of my two favourites along with the sun. I love it. Whenever I buy a new deck, the two cards that I always want to see first are the sun and the moon. I'm always fascinated how artists have interpreted them. So, when it appears in a reading, the unconscious, the stirring of our fears, both the conscious fears and the primal fears. So if it appears in a reading, we are very much stepping into the unconscious realm. We have to pay attention to our instinctive realm. So let's forget the rational. This is all about the world of instinct and subconscious. Now, when it appears, we need to illuminate those two areas. We need to shine a light on our instincts, and we sometimes need to shine a light on those basest and deepest fears that we think we dare not face. If it's trying to crawl out of the pool, we actually have to get out the way and let it crawl out and let it be illuminated. So in practical terms, this is a very powerful card, because if we're being held back by our fears, or if our behaviour, our sort of instinctive behaviours are limiting us, it's time to take a close look. So that's upright. If we reverse it, or if we're looking at the darker aspect, this is when, as Waite says, the nameless obscenity is actually sinking back into the pool. Now, the deeper it goes, the less illumination, the less we can understand. So there's a lot at stake when this card appears. It's a challenging card because actually to face those primal instincts and our deepest fears very often comes at a cost. But let's look at the light of the moon and also the dewdrops, the yods. I think what that says to me, as a humanist with pagan leanings perhaps, an agnostic with pagan leanings but with lots of humanism thrown in, that's probably a better description of me. You may not believe in divine guidance or divine comfort, but I do believe that actually that comfort comes from the people in the world around me, if only I know where to look for it. If you believe in divine guidance and divine comfort, that's wonderful. But what this card says is that it's there. You know, those fears, those drives that sometimes control us, they're not the whole story. There is support and there is comfort when we seek to illuminate those and understand them, and understand how we can either work with them or overcome them. That's the path that we follow when we're engaging with this card. That's the path that takes us to the horizon and towards the moon. Isn't that beautiful? So, that's the moon card. Let's move on to card number 19, the sun. My very favourite card in the deck, both visually and in terms of its message. There it is. The sun from the Rider-Waite Tarot. You can see a child on a white horse bearing a giant red banner on a standard. The child is wearing a floral crown with a red feather coming from it. This is a child or a baby, possibly a baby. You can see he's riding out from a walled garden. Now, within those walls, you can see sunflowers, 4 sunflowers, to reflect the positive nature of the sun. Now, look at the sun itself. It's benign. I don't know whether that's a smile. It's a peaceful gaze. 22 rays emerging from the sun. Some wavy, some straight. The wavy ones represent heat for me. The straight ones represent light. 22 is significant. I think that mirrors the 22 major arcana, showing that the message of the cards is wise and transformative. Okay, so that's the Rider-Waite. Let's look at some of the others. Simple image again when we go back to the Visconti deck, but like the moon card, showing Diana and thereby showing that all the symbolism and influences of the card can find their key in the nature of the goddess. You see something similar here. You see what would be called in Renaissance terms a putti. Cherub is not necessarily the right word, but you can see this winged child on a cloud bearing above his head the manifestation of the god Apollo, the sun disk. Okay, so floating on a cloud above a verdant and mountainous earth. You've got the mountains in the background, a castle, and the green fields in front. Interestingly, you see the cliff edge like you do on the Fool card. So there's something to think about. That's something I've not thought about until now. So that's the Visconti depiction. Let's have a look at the Marseille depiction. We see the walled garden as we do in the Rider-Waite, but what we see here is different. We don't just see one child, we see 2. Possibly twins, possibly Castor and Pollux of constellation mythology, possibly Romulus and Remus of Greco-Roman mythology. But what we see is 2 children within or without of the walled garden under the joyous influence of the sun. So let's have a look at the 1JJ variant. This is interesting because it reflects something that you see in so many of the other earlier versions. This shows a young man and a young woman under the joyous sun. Now, on a lot of the earlier cards, the key is not the sexes of the children or the 2 young people. The key is the duality. We see that duality through male and female here. But if we're looking at, let's just go back to the twins, Castor and Pollux, or Romulus and Remus. Let me just have a look at my notes. Yes, Pollux was immortal, Castor was mortal. It was Romulus who was immortal, Remus was mortal. So again, we have the duality. What we have in the Sun card is the reconciliation of those dualities. Everyone is united under the joy of the Sun. Okay? We see the duality depicted even more clearly in the Golden Dawn version. You have a male child kneeling on land and a female child kneeling on water within the walled garden. But they're holding hands joyously. Okay. Now, interestingly, again, you see dewdrops, just as we did here. Dewdrops on the sun, as well as on the moon. Now, Anton Court de Gebelin, the French occultist, he referred to them as the dewdrops of gold and the dewdrops of pearl. So obviously the pearl dewdrops are the dew of the moon. The golden dewdrops are the dew of the sun. Now both represent benevolent nourishment coming from the two heavenly bodies. So in the case of the Golden Dawn, these are represented once again as yods, showing divine nourishment, divine inspiration. Okay. So we've looked at the Rider-Waite version already, which we're going to come back to in a minute. Let's look at the Thoth. The Thoth shows the walled garden, but it's on the top of a hill. Now you can see the twins, or are they male and female? They may be. They are winged and joyous and celebrating. They're outside the wall. So that gives a sense of freedom. That sense of freedom we'll see again in the Rider-Waite, freedom and liberation. You've gone from an enclosed space into the outside world. Now, the sun here is shown as a flower radiating 12 rays. Now, those rays are basically the divisions that show the zodiac. Think of, if you can see all the zodiac signs arrayed around the sun. So what you see is the heavens revolving around the sun in a yearly cycle. So those rays become the divisions of the zodiac cycle. It's an incredible image. So once again, we have the sun and the moon denoting the passing of time. But what we see here is the wheel of the year. Now that's something that we've also discussed through our discussions of the Wheel of Fortune, but it's very, very specifically denoted here in this Thoth card. Okay, so the passage of time, warmth and blessing, the dewdrops of gold. What else have we got here that actually sets this card aside from the moon and also ahead of the moon in terms of progression? I think we need to look at them together to answer that question. What we see here is the deepest fears of the subconscious rising to the top of the pool, as Waite says, very often sinking back. Now what we have here, under the influence of the sun, you could say that the baby represents the liberated crayfish. This child is riding triumphant out of the limited garden, bearing a red standard banner. Now, the red standard is the symbol of victory. Now, one other interesting thing. Let's go back to the Fool card, because there's one symbol from the Fool card that we see replicated in the Sun card. So there's the Fool. Now, in the Fool's headdress is a red feather. Okay? We see exactly the same red feather in this Sun child. So the journey of the Fool is beginning to find its realization and fulfillment in the Sun card. Rebirth and fulfillment. Okay? That red feather very directly ties this child to the Fool. Now, the Fool was carrying a backpack on his pole. What's now on the pole is the red standard of victory and fulfillment. So, the Sun is probably the most positive and joyous card in the deck. The light of the Moon drew all our fears and insecurities up. In the light of the Sun, we can face those fears and we can find freedom from them. So this card is in effect warmth, nourishment, joy, freedom and liberation. So in its most basic sense, the light and the warmth of the Sun is what brings life to our solar system. What we saw in the Moon card is the reflected light of the Sun. The Moon shines reflected light back down to the Earth at night when the Sun is below the horizon. Here, the light, the nourishment and the warmth is direct. So, the sunflowers. The sunflowers, it's something that I've only recently clocked, is that there's 4 of them. So, the number 4, we're into the realms of things like the 4 elements, the 4 directions. What else? The 4 seasons, you know. The 4 seasons in the same way as the zodiac signs on the Thoth card tie this into the yearly cycle. The 4 elements make this a very worldly card. The 4 directions bring in, the north, south, east and west, again, making it a very earthly card in that we are tied to the earth and the points of the compass. It's beautiful. It is just wonderful. When it appears in a reading, actually what this means is simply freedom and liberation and joy. I think that shows very much in the card. Interestingly, if you think this symbolism is unique to Waite, it's not. Let's go back to Nigel Jackson's Fortuna's Wheel Tarot. The Sun and the Moon, again, based on the earlier Vivet deck models, and you can see something very similar here. The child or the youth on the horse with the banner of victory. Okay. Can you reverse this and find a dark side? I don't think you can. I mean, let's do that. Maybe it sort of blunts the power of the Sun a little bit. Maybe if you're looking for any negative, the Sun can burn. Maybe you're looking at the sort of overpowering aspects of the Sun here. Maybe, I don't know, actually, can it? Yeah, form your own conclusion on that one. This is one of those instances where the card is just so positive, it's difficult to blunt it. I tend to think that there isn't really a negative aspect. If it comes up in a reversal in a reading, maybe the positive influences are slightly diluted. It's a difficult call. A lot of my fellow tarot readers take different views on this. I think you just got to go with your own instincts. When something is that good, it is kind of difficult to find a negative in it. So there you have it. The Sun and the Moon, the passing of time, the conscious and the unconscious. Yes, the Moon was the liberated unconscious. The Sun is the liberated conscious. Everything is here in the light. Wonderful, wonderful cards. I've maybe missed a couple of things out. I don't know, but I can't be objective with these cards, I just love them. These are my two favourites, so I hope I've covered virtually everything. I hope it's been helpful. And that will lead us to the final lesson, covering the last two cards of the Major Arcana, which go even above and beyond the joy and the wonders of the sun. We'll be looking at card number 20, the card of Judgment, and card number 21, the card of the World. So I hope you'll join me next time, and I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this lesson and found it helpful, please hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel to find out when I share new videos or go live. You can also find me on Instagram at Chris Butler Artist, on Twitter at Butler Tarot, and on Facebook at The Sacred Tarot. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.